Welcome back to episode 5 of the Storyteller Soul Lounge. This is going to be the last episode that I air until the month of July. I'm going to be stepping back for June. It's my birthday month, but also to recalibrate and focus on other things other than this. Not that I'm feeling disconnected to the story anyway. The revisionist will eventually kind of progress, but my mental health has become, a priority. It always is. And I think it being technically Mental Health Awareness Month, it's kind of fitting, but it's just a really long vacation, but it's not. Um, so the thing is, I am in a liminal space right now. Not that this bodes an explanation and it does kind of deter the podcast a little bit, but the reason I haven't been recording is because I got a little sick. First of all, I caught something and then I basically was too exhausted to talk for a few weeks. I was recovering. But I also have a day job as a barista at a coffee shop. And I I know that I've probably talked about this before, but I lost my job about 2 years ago, and it'll be 2 years in July. My entertainment job where I was working for a film studio, and things haven't been normal for me since. I was living in Florida at the time, and in a matter of months there was sort of like a ripple effect of these things that were happening where I lost my car, and then a year later I had to put my dog down, and then about 2 months after that we were facing eviction. So I thankfully got an agreement between me and my previous landlord. And so essentially we had to relocate. So now I'm in this physical liminal space trying to figure out, my next steps and where I would like to go. And so I'm maintaining like a day job and trying to do all of that while still passionately, writing and doing those things. In fact, a script that I had been working on for a very long time, almost 2 years, I finally finished and submitted to a festival. So fingers crossed. I'll be doing that. In fact, I've finished 3 pilot scripts that I was really loving. And that's actually kind of where we will segue into today's episode, which is called The Melody of Courage. And I didn't want to deep dive into the revisionists right now. I'm going to sidebar that for episode 6 when I return and we focus back on the show and what I was building, to talk about something that I don't feel I see often as a creative. When I'm watching other people talk about their experiences, I always see, like I've said before, the before and the after. I've always seen, this is what I struggled with, and here's how I became successful. And the messy in between parts, I don't see that often when I'm experiencing writer's block and the creative process and the mental health struggles that we go through. And so this episode is kind of talking about what sort of runs through my mind when I'm dealing with writer's block and how I get through it and the methods I've used that I've built in for myself, but also just honestly talking about why it's so hard sometimes to do this. And so to start kind of like structurally and logically, I have a few methods that I use when I get into a creative block. And these are methods that I've coined as the sandbox mode, or I go into sandbox mode. And I've mentioned them a few times in the podcast already. It's nothing like the anchoring method or the methods that I actually use for story development and screenwriting. They're specifically sandbox mode because it involves play and exploration and re-engaging the creative muscle rather than forcing structure and rigidness essentially of your imagination. And so These methods are simply to play, or it's called the Soulful Play Suite, my bad, but it's sandbox methodology essentially. And so the sandbox mode itself is a commentary framework. And what this is you're creating a structural rhythm lens with an audience POV, and you are writing a scene, or I am writing a scene. I will sometimes jump ahead to, okay, let's use this TV show pilot that I've now submitted. I wrote a TV show for the past 2 years, or I've been working on one called Love Letters and Coffee Breaks. And the pilot is now, registered with the WGA, and it's now being submitted to festivals because 2 years in the making, I'm telling you, I was busting my butt trying to get this story figured out. It takes place across 3 different timelines, and there's a lot of beautiful things about it, from like music to memory to objects with like heavy weight as far as emotional attachments, and just a lot of great storytelling. But it was so complex that I often had to pull myself out of it, which is why it took so long. But it was also coming to me in bits and pieces. It wasn't coming to me with dialogue. It was coming through lyricism first, because it's about 2 musicians, and I heard their melodies before I heard their dialogue. So I was writing songs that I believed they were going to sing in the show. And essentially, because this was coming to me in waves, it was like a puzzle piece. And so I got to the point where I wrote about maybe 7 drafts with this script because it was so complex and delicate. Not to mention, I got in my head a lot because I cared about the characters. The story was close to me. I know who these people are and where I've seen them before. And it manifested as just a big part of my soul. And so I held it so close to the chest that I think I almost sabotaged the process in a lot of ways. So sandbox methodology is one that I built because of this show. Oftentimes, if I couldn't see the pilot right away, I built scenes in a sandbox, and they were much like the songs coming to me. They were in bits and pieces, and I would write these 2 characters in a scene that was maybe for episode 2, 3, 4, way ahead of the actual pilot, to envision what I was seeing. I was taking what I could see immediately and putting them in these random scenes with random scenarios, and getting to know the dialogue and the flow and the tone of the show through sandbox methodology. And once I do a scene, I take the sandbox commentary and I use the structural lens with the audience POV. Essentially, what I'm asking when I'm looking at these sandbox scenes is, what are key takeaways? What's standing out to me? What's memorable dialogue? What are great character moments? What are key story motifs and themes that I'm going to use? And then there are the must keep moments, and like thinking about how the audience would react to this scene or what they want to see more of. Put yourself in the audience POV. And you do that with these sandbox scenes, with every one of them. And not every single one is going to stick or land. And a lot of the times, sandbox methodology can develop through all the other Soulful Play Suite techniques. You can use the techniques in sandbox mode to create these scenes. And one of my personal favorites is, because I'm a musician, I use the listening room technique a lot, especially for a show like Love Letters, because when I was doing the show, I heard the soundtrack as clear as day. And there's not only original music in the show, but there's also nostalgia songs, because one of the timelines takes place in the 90s. And so I would turn on the soundtrack to the show, and then I would listen for what the story is telling me, where I feel a disconnection from. It is a sound-based immersion of how you can prompt a scene for sandbox mode. And I love doing this because I think in rhythms, I think in melody, And a show like Love Letters, the one that I was struggling with the most, was heavily dedicated to my music background. And without artists and the soundtrack, like I was hearing Olivia Dean, I was hearing, I think it's Luca Fagali. I heard the band Couch, which is a really great band for a lot of the, the present day tone. I'm hearing, nostalgia pieces for the 90s, but like late 90s. There's a character who I see, listening to Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and Spice Girls. But there's also another character, the other musician, who I feel like comes from David Bowie and The Clash and artists like that. And then there's the middle timeline, which takes place in like the early 2000s in college era. And I pulled from artists that I listened to as a musician when I went to college. And so there's a lot of Jason Mraz, Sarah Bareilles, and John Mayer, and artists that essentially kind of fill a coffee shop vibe. And so the listening room technique in sandbox mode helps me to unblock a lot of rhythms and tones and the way a character sounds, moves, the way a scene moves, and it helps to basically bring in the pilot. And so there's the speed dating technique and the blind date technique, which I've already shown in previous episodes, which also go into the sandbox methodology. Speed dating, obviously, you're meeting new characters, so it's good for first time TV shows. And then there's the blind date technique, which again tests your enemy versus your hero, or you can test romantic leads chemistry, which is great for a show like Love Letters, but I never used the blind date technique because I didn't have it created. The ones that I think for a show that I was working on like this is Follow the Thread, which is a very interesting concept or technique to use in sandbox methodology. And I was using it very often for this show because there were so many timelines weaving. And it helps with by picking a character and figuring out where they begin, where they end up in the middle, and where they end up in the end of the episode. So you follow them and you trace their steps and you figure out who they interact with, what locations they're in, and then you go back and you analyze the thread, and then you take another character, you do the same thing, and you're seeing how they're moving parallel to each other or how things are moving. And you kind of look at like what's blocking and what's not working. And then there's the unraveling story technique, the last one in the sandbox, which is a diagnostic exploration tool to track story flow, momentum. And that's basically almost, to me, a more analytical sandbox method, because you're laying the story out by listing the scenes in order. You're observing where the story feels tight, where it needs to breathe, where the momentum is like accelerating and where it stalls, and flow and logic as far as do the transitions move smoothly. You're checking the fabric because you're unraveling the thread. And so if you pull one scene out, what unravels? If you tighten one, what changes? Is there something that's not necessary? Is there something that is? And so it feels like more of an analytical sandbox play mode, but it still helps me with creative block. And these are all methods that I use to push through those spaces where you get into your head too much, you overthink an idea. And I know it's cliche, but one of the other things that helps me as a writer is sometimes I have to walk away from something. And it's good for me because in the middle of a day, I could be listening to the soundtrack again, and I'm always listening to the songs that inspire the shows because I never know what might come up. I'll be thinking about a show, a scene, characters, random times of the day, and I'll realize what was blocking me before. But the truth is, despite having methodologies and all these tools, nothing can account for drive, passion, connecting to the story. And when you don't have that, that's the part that makes it absolutely difficult for me. I have spent, most of my life struggling with depression and anxiety. And I found out from my therapist that I often used to use writing as a kid as a coping mechanism. And so, because I get so attached to these stories, these characters, it creates this lack of courage to share my ideas with people, to push through the story, as if I'm trying to prevent it from becoming real. And I had to figure out where half of that was coming from. And so I think now my creativity, my fears as an artist, because I've defined my voice more now that I'm older, I feel more assured in my identity as far as my stories go. I often feel sometimes that the real me would not be good enough, because it's far more painful to risk authenticity, to speak the melody of courage, and to face rejection or even be misunderstood than it is to risk the mask you're wearing. Because I'm afraid that my stories will never be heard, that all of this love, wisdom, passion, and truth that I have within me will never see the light of day. The industry scares me. I often can't tell if I'm preventing myself from that, or maybe the world isn't ready for what I have to say. I'm afraid I'll never matter sometimes, obscurity, and I won't make a difference, not in a sense of fame or notoriety, but that I won't make an impact, that I'll fade out into the background, and I have to watch the world around me change, and there's nothing I can do about it, and I feel powerless because I want to make the world a better place. I'm often caught between the liminal thoughts of I'm running out of time, like I'm too old to join this industry, and it's never too late. Both of those dance in my brain. And there's a tug of war with the universe, or fate, if you believe in it, between maybe this isn't meant for me, but I know deep down this is what I'm supposed to do. And if I were to cave in to the one that steers me away from what I do, I'm afraid the price of giving up is a lack of self love. Because without creativity, to settle, in a sense, would reject what's embedded, or what I feel is embedded into my DNA. The deeper I've learned myself through stories and music, I've learned to strengthen my intuition and my instincts and what I sound like. And to give in to failure would feel like self erasure. I love who I am now, and I'm proud of who I am, and I'm afraid to be courageous with my soul. These stories, my songs, they're how I translate it all. And I'm willing to risk the exposure. I know I am. But I'm also admitting it's absolutely terrifying trying to do this. And some of the stories I write and the songs that I sing, the way in which I translate the world will come out distorted or muffled or misunderstood. But I know that once the clarity comes in, the only tone that I want to hear is the melody of courage. And it's not a perfect one either. It's sometimes out of tune. It doesn't make sense to you, or to me, I mean. But in the words of Brene Brown, read Atlas of the Heart if you haven't, there is no vulnerability without courage, no courage without vulnerability. And if I'm terrified to sing that melody, when that feeling, that sensation comes in where you know you're scared when you're about to do something, it's typically the right thing for me to do. I've never been one to shy away from getting outside of the comfort zone. So, yes, I'm afraid as an artist. And despite that, I am going to take the stage every single time, or in this case, I am going to get back on the page, even if it takes me 2 years to finish a script. And I think that just comes with time and patience and grace as a writer. So that's where I'm landing right now for the last episode, is the melody of courage. And I hope that for those who struggle with creativity like me and who have all of those inner voices in your head telling you a whole bunch of things, I hope that you find your voice too and that you're courageous enough to use it. So, but for now, I go on a break for the month of June. I appreciate those who have been tuning in and watching. And I promise to come back a little bit more refreshed and take some time for myself. But I'm also only human. Keep telling stories, and I'll see you guys in the lounge in July.